The Medeco is an American high-security lock which was first patented in 1968 by Roy Spain. Consistent among all of its models, its key pins must be both lifted and rotated for the lock to open. This is accomplished by a key pin with a V-shaped bottom known as a chisel point. The chisel point of the key pin interacts with the angled cuts in the key, causing it to rotate in one of three rotational positions: -20, 0, and 20 degrees. It is also lifted to one of 6 heights. The key pin has a deep vertical groove called the true gate, and a shallow vertical groove or false gate. In this lateral cutaway of the M3, we can see that once the key is inserted, two things occur. The key pins are all lifted to the shear line, and they are also all rotated so that their true gates align laterally and allow the projections of the sidebar to retract into them. With a plug rotated, it is easier to see how these sidebar projections interact with the true gates on the key pins. There are 4 versions of the Medeco: the original, biaxial, M3, and M4. The Medeco original was introduced in 1968. Its chisel point is centered on the key pin. It has either standard or mushroom T drivers. The biaxial was introduced in 1986. It has the chisel point of the key pin skewed in either an anterior 4 or posterior aft position. These are known as biaxial key pins and have been maintained in all subsequent models. It has standard or mushroom drivers. The M3 was introduced in 2004. It too has biaxial key pins and standard or mushroom drivers. Newer versions of the M3 have countermilling with matching barrel drivers. The M3 introduced a slider found in the bottom of the keyway. This slider has 2 tabs on the top that block the second and third sidebar projections, highlighted in yellow, from fully engaging with the true gates in the key pins. The slider must be pushed back so that its tabs may enter the green recesses. Once the slider is pushed back, the sidebar projections are fully exposed so that they may engage with the true gates of the key pins. Finally, the M4 was introduced in 2021. It has the same biaxial key pins and drivers as the M3. The plug is countermilled to interact with the barrel drivers. New to this model are 4 sprung sliders, which must be lifted to the correct height so that their true gates align and allow the sidebar to retract into them. Let's take a look at the key pins in more detail. This is a top view of the key pin sitting in a pin chamber in the plug of the lock. On the right is its true gate. On the left, in blue, is the rotation limiter. The rotation limiter is a projection on the top of the key pin, which is restricted in movement by this cutout in the pin chamber. This allows the pin to be rotated 20 degrees in either direction and allows for 3 possible positions of the true gate. The chisel tip on the bottom of the key pin is always in line with the rotation limiter. Here it is superimposed on top of the key pin as the key pin is rotated. In order for any pin to be oriented properly to accept the sidebar projection, its true gate must be pointed to the right. Let's look at each of the 3 rotational key pin types. This is the 0-degree key pin, and its relative chisel tip orientation shown in yellow on the left. The chisel tip on the bottom of the key pin must be rotated to 0 degrees for the true gate of this key pin to be correctly oriented to interact with the sidebar. The 0-degree key pin has 1 true gate and no false gates. This is the 20-degree key pin. The chisel tip on the bottom of this key pin must be rotated to 20 degrees for the true gate to be correctly oriented. It has 1 true gate and either 1 or 0 false gates. Finally, this is the -20-degree key pin. The chisel tip on the bottom of this key pin must be rotated -20 degrees for the true gate to be correctly oriented. It too has 1 true gate and either 1 or 0 false gates. These are the 3 rotational position key pin types with their true gates lined up to the right side, and the position of the chisel tip in yellow when in this orientation. Biaxial key pins are used in the Medeco biaxial, M3, and M4. They have a skew chisel point in the fore or aft position, 3 rotational positions, and 6 possible key pin heights. 2 times 3 times 6 makes 36 unique key pin types. The Medeco Original has a centered chisel point, and therefore 18 unique key pin types. Now let's shift our attention and take a look at the sidebar and sliders of the new Medeco M4. As with every model of the Medeco, the M4 sidebar has 6 small projections which interact with the vertical true gate of each key pin. New to this model, the M4 has cylindrical cutouts in the sidebar to accommodate the 4 sliders. In each cutout there is a horizontal bar that interacts with the gates of the sliders. Let's take a closer look at the slider types. There are 4 sprung sliders in the M4 which interact with a key, 3 regular sliders, and 1 interactive slider which is pushed up by this interactive element. According to Medeco's marketing information, there are 3 regular slider types. After analyzing the design, it is theoretically possible to produce a 4th regular slider type, which is shown on the right. Here they are all lined up by their true gates. The interactive slider has a notch cut out of its bottom. It has no false gates. This is where the interactive element of the key pushes up the slider. Let's take a look at how each slider interacts with the sidebar in isolation. In the following demonstration, the slider will be displayed on the right panel, and the specific gate that is being tested will be pointed out by an arrow. It is important to note that when multiple sliders are installed in the lock, a given slider will only behave in the following manner if it is the current slider that is binding. Slider 1 is the minimum lift slider. It needs only be slightly nudged up to catch its true gate. It is possible to overlift this slider, in which case the false gate will engage the sidebar and will become stiff. Slider 2 has its true gate flanked in between 2 false gates. In its neutral position, the first false gate will bind into the sidebar. Slow counter rotation and continuous tapping on the slider will allow the slider to be moved up into its true gate. Once again, if the slider is pushed too high, it will engage with the next false gate and the slider will become stiff. Slider 3 has its false gate first in line and will bind to the sidebar, causing it to become stiff. As with slider 2, slow counter rotation and tapping on the slider will allow the slider to be manipulated into its true gate. The last slider type is the interactive slider. It is essentially the same lift height as slider 2, but has no false gates to deal with. There are 2 ways to lift this slider. The first is by slipping the pick underneath this part of the slider with a lateral motion. The other is by rotating the pick to interact with and lift this ledge of the slider. Alright, let's get to picking. With all previous Medeco models, the most common behavior is isolation of lifting and rotating of the key pins. The order which depends on the direction of tensioning. Tensioning clockwise requires lifting and then rotating. Counterclockwise requires rotating then lifting. This M4 tensioned in the clockwise direction mixes the binding of lifting and rotating, which is a very kind of unusual behavior, especially in the older models. Once the key pins are all set, you will get a false set and then the sidebar needs to be picked. Counterclockwise is a total nightmare. The sidebar engages early and therefore causes a significant increase in difficulty. The bitting on this lock is perhaps the most challenging possible, with high lifts in 1, 5, and 6 associated with barrels, and low lifts in the middle of the lock. Position 3 has a mushroom, which once picked causes all the set barrels to drop. The pick that I'm using is a Ratyoke original. It's modeled after the number 7 Peterson, which is my favorite pick for the Medeco. I'm tensioning in the clockwise direction and getting to the back of the lock. Number 6 is a plus 20 rotation, high lift barrel, and it's a nice click at a 6. It's going to 5. 5 is a minus 20 barrel, high lift, nice click at a 5. And these are not set all the way, even though they're passing the jiggle test. They're going to bind a little bit later. That's 4, which is a 0 rotation. And that feels set. 3 is the mushroom. Normally when I lift this up, everything drops. I got really lucky here. I'm gonna try to set number 2 now, which is a plus 20 rotation. Small lift, doesn't feel like it's binding, and then trying to pick 1. 1 is a high lift barrel up front. It's perhaps the hardest pin to get up front. A high lift up front is just a torture chamber. Going to the back of the lock. 6 feels okay. 5, that also feels okay. 4, that feels jiggly and fine. 3, that feels good too. 2 is a plus 20 and it's bound rotationally, so I'm trying to let up a little bit on the tension and teasing it into position. Nothing's binding on 1. Little click out of 6. And that little clicky sound is a sound of a rotationally set pin. And that was a click out of 2. 1 is still loose. Going to the back of the lock. 6 feels okay. You can see that I'm trying to set pin number 5, but pin number 4 is blocking me. It's a low set pin and I just can't lift it high enough. So later on, I'm gonna have to get a deeper hook. Once again, that little clicky sound is the sound of a rotationally set pin, which is pin number 4, that low lift bastard pin. Clicky sound on 6, that means that that's rotationally set. And here comes Peterson 5, the deep hook to address 5 and 6. Six seems set with the jiggle test. Going to 5, it's a little stiff. Nice click. And 6 seems set. So let's get back to the number 7. Going back to 1, which is the high lift barrel up front. Hasn't bound yet, but nice click. And a quick check of the sliders, which are totally loose. Six seems to be binding now. Nice click. And it's jiggly. That was a tiny click out of 1, and I thought that I felt the plug move. I'm going to try to check the 4th slider, and it clicked, and I think I felt it move and bind. So I'm going to grab my multi-pick number 5, dimple pick, and yeah, it feels like that's set. Two, 3, 4 seems like it's set, but none of the other ones are moving. This probably means that there's one more key pin that just needs to be set so that I can bind the sidebar a little tighter so that the rest of the sliders can be set. 1 is still loose. 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 2, 1, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, that's not going to work. And that's the problem. 5 dropped. Trying to lift it up. It's bound. Nice click. Okay, not so convinced that 5 is set. Let's check the slider. Totally loose. Back to 5. It's binding. That's the click. And now that slider is binding. 4 is binding. So a little counter rotation and lifting. And we're going to go back to the multi-pick number 5. So slider 4 is set. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4 is jiggly is set. 2, 3 seems to be binding now. 3 is set. 2 is set. And 1 is now in a false gate. Let's check the other sliders. That's 2. Back to 3, the interactive. Now it's 4. That's feels good. 2, 1. I'm counter rotating and tapping on number 1, and now it's set. Number 2, and we're open. That is first pick ever of the new Medeco M4. My rear camera monitor is facing backwards, and so I'm going to turn it back around, save it, and turn it off. Let's take this guy to the vise now. I'm going to show you the cam on the back. It's clearly picked. Lock it back up. Okay, so as I'm pulling out these key pins and drivers out of this lock, I wanted to give you some of my final thoughts on the new M4. I do think it has the potential to be a significant improvement over the previous model if the following conditions are met. There should be a minimum of 3 barrels installed in every lock. Multiple barrels really make the Medeco lock significantly more pick resistant. 1 or 2 mushroom pins should also be in the lock. They increase pick resistance by resetting the barrels, which have already been picked. So it's a fantastic addition to the lock. Standard drivers really don't add anything, so they should be completely abandoned. Especially there's these new standard drivers that have these tapered ends, which are a terrible design, and they should really be taken out of circulation. Lastly, there should be a minimum of 2 sliders of the Type 2 or 3 variety installed in every sidebar. Less than that amount really makes that sidebar trivial in picking. Speaking of sidebars, here it is with its 6 key-pin projections and the cylindrical cutouts for the sliders. Let's take a look at the plug of the lock. That's where the sidebar goes into. And here are the pin chambers with the serrated countermilling. That's in chambers 1, 2, skipping 3, 4, 5, and 6. Next, I'm going to pull out the key, and we're going to take out all the sliders. These are the chambers that hold all the sliders. Let's take a closer look at the pinning tray. Bottom row is key pins, next row is drivers, and the top row there are the 4 sliders. And that's it. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this pick, and if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you at the next video.